Dear ladies and gentlemen, students, colleagues, welcome to the Multatuli lecture. The Multatuli lecture is a Dutch-Flemish initiative held 1 year in the Dutch province of Brabant in the city of Breda, and the next in the Flemish province of Brabant in the city of Leuven. The lectures in Leuven are organized by Meta Forum, the interdisciplinary advisory board of KU Leuven. The theme of Multatuli lecture is always related to the challenges of the multicultural societies of the future. For my generation, Multatuli's Max Havelaar was required reading, and we all knew the story of Saidia and Adinda. It read like a scathing indictment of imperialist colonialism. The book was first published in 1860, more than 80 years before Indonesian independence. Multatuli was ahead of his time. It has been said of Multatuli that his accent was attuned to his heartbeat, and the only customs an honorable pen had to observe, and the only customs his honorable pen had to observe, were the regal whims of his imagination and the worshipful vagaries of his moods. He wrote as he spoke as he thought, and he always thought passionately. Indeed, it was Multatuli's passionate personality that made his voice resound through the time like that of a prophet in the desert. And that gave us his wonderful literature. Even though no passion is entirely disinterested, the reason we continue reading Multatuli's inspired novels clearly has to do with the fact that his passion was aimed at inciting people to greater justice. In his aversion to what Havelaar calls half-heartedness, Multatuli sought words that could break down the walls of indifference, words that could emotionally inspire people to cry out against colonial injustice. The guest speaker for this Multatuli lecture is Jean Drèze. He will be introduced by Laure van der Walle. Laure van der Walle is professor of economics at the KU Leuven and the Graduate Institute of Genova. Her research focuses on financial inclusion, micro-enterprise development, and gender in India, Bangladesh and Uganda. She has also worked on political reservations and public goods in India. Who better than her to introduce our guest speaker? I'm happy to give the floor to Professor Laure van der Walle.
Good evening, and thank you very much for waiting until the room finally freed up. Defenses are very important. So in 2018, the World Bank published a report on the state of social safety nets around the world. Okay, the social safety nets include cash transfers, in-kind transfers, social pensions, public works, and school feeding programs. They estimated that 36% of the very poor escaped extreme poverty thanks to these programs. Yet, in low-income countries, only 1 in 5 of the poorest are actually covered. On average, countries in Europe, countries in Central Asia, they spend the highest share of their GDP on social safety nets. India spends a way lower share, it's about 1%, but it's still the highest compared to other South Asian countries. It also houses the most extensive public workfare program in the world, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, also known as NREGA. In the early 2000s, the National Advisory Council was essential in drafting several important bills allowing all of these advances, such as the Food Security Bill, the Right to Education Act, and MG. One of the committee is today's speaker, Jean Drèze. So, who is Jean Drèze? He's born in Belgium. We can and should be proud. He studied mathematical economics at the University of Essex and completed his PhD at the Indian Statistical Institute in New Delhi. He has taught at the London and at the Delhi School of Economics. He became an Indian citizen and hence actually had to give up his Belgian nationality. By choosing India as his base, he immersed himself in the challenges of low-income countries, studying systemic inequities and working towards grassroots-level solutions. I do not want to elaborate too much upon these now, but among development economists, he's also referred to as a living legend. Jean Drèze is widely recognized as a pioneering economist whose academic work has impacted development economics, public policy, and welfare theory. His scholarly contributions extend beyond theoretical frameworks to offer actionable insights into some of the most pressing socio-economic challenges in India and in other low-income countries. A distinguishing feature of his combination of extensive fieldwork, qualitative analysis of everyday life and poverty, and quantitative work. These form the basis for his analysis of government schemes and create a powerful blend of rigorous academic research and practical policy interventions. His work has significantly shaped some of India's most transformative policies, focusing on eradicating poverty, improving food security, enhancing social welfare, and empowering marginalized communities. Jean will undoubtedly discuss some of these schemes this evening, but I do want to elaborate a bit on contributions to two of the major programs, as I kind of suspect that he will skip that part himself. First, Jean Drèze provided critical input in shaping the 2013 National Food Security Act, or NFSA. The Act provides legal entitlement to subsidized food grains to 2/3 of India's population and strengthens the public distribution system to ensure that food reaches vulnerable populations effectively. Important insights that helped shape the Act go back to his early work with Nobel laureate Amartya. In the book Hunger and Public Action, they explore the dynamics of famine, of food security, and public intervention, highlighting how famine is often not caused by the lack of food availability, but by inequitable access. The book underscores the role of the government and civil society in alleviating hunger. They use the existing public distribution system already as a case study and started advocating for its expansion and reform. So this book was published in 1989 already, but it still has a lasting impact. So in case you're still in need of a small gift under the Christmas tree, I highly recommend it. Further drawing from his field studies in the years that followed, Jean highlighted gaps in existing food security measures and implementation mechanisms and proposed actionable solutions, such as improving transparency and expanding the coverage. He engaged with civil society organizations and policymakers to garner support for the Act, which eventually played a vital role in reducing hunger and malnutrition in India. Secondly, he was also a key architect of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. NREGA is a groundbreaking initiative that annually guarantees 100 days of wage employment to rural households. In his academic work, Jean emphasized the idea of employment as a fundamental right rather than a conditional welfare program. He also emphasized the multiplier effects, demonstrating how public work programs could stimulate rural economies through increased household consumption and, at the same time, infrastructural development. Furthermore, he underscored the importance of the demand-driven nature of the program, where work must be provided to anyone requesting it, thereby preventing discretion-based exclusions. This made the scheme accessible to marginalized groups, including women. It actually increased female labor force participation, and also to lower castes. All these insights have shaped the program, which has been instrumental in alleviating rural poverty and fostering rural development. Recent work, not Jean's, so there is no conflict of interest, but by other development economists has confirmed this. The program raised wages, moderated violence, and generally improved living conditions. As pointed out earlier, the progress over the past decades has been important, but there is still a long way to go, and new challenges arise. For example, the rush by the current government to become a digital economy risks leaving behind those who might benefit the most. Jean already pointed this out back in 2013 when I asked some advice on a new project we wanted to launch. He was skeptical after half an hour. We realized the same, but only 9 months later. Dear Jean, it's an absolute honor to welcome you at the KU Leuven. We are delighted to hear more about your insights and to learn from your experience this evening.
Thank you, Laura, for this very generous introduction. And thank you, everyone, for inviting me to be with you today and say a few words in memory of Multatuli, who set a rare example of principled opposition to colonialism among the European writers of his day, and also invited us to resist abuses of power in other domains. This is really a moving and historic moment for me because I was born in this beautiful city many years ago, just around the corner, and I still have very fond memories of the times I spent in Leuven as a child until the age of 12 or perhaps 13. Initially, attending primary school at the Lycée Virgo Sapiens, I don't know if it still exists, and later commuting every day by train to Bassoivre, where I was attending secondary school. I came on the same train in the other direction this afternoon, and I walked here, and I was amazed by the beauty of the city. I think it may be more beautiful today than it was in those days. So that cheered me up. But I'm not going to bore you with my childhood memories. I'll just say that these were really happy days, and also days when we were confident that the world would become a better place in our lifetime. Little did I realize that this overconfidence was based on a blinkered knowledge of history. When I look back at my childhood in the light of Multatuli's ideas, it strikes me in particular how little we were told in those days about the dark history of Belgian colonialism. Perhaps Flemish children, with the help of some of Multatuli's books, like Max Havelaar, and I'm glad to hear that it was widely read or is widely read, perhaps the Flemish children did think a little bit about Belgium's colonial past, but we did not. Instead, we were reading Tintin au Congo, Tintin in Congo, where the white hero is projected as the savior of the black savages when he is not shooting a huge number of wild animals for the fun. Even in secondary school, we went through long history courses without hearing a word about the history of plunder, violence, and forced labor in Congo. And of course, we never heard of the assassination of Patrice Lumumba and its possible connection with Belgium. I trust that Belgians today are better aware of this history, and I hope that they're telling their children about it too. Before I proceed to talk about social security in India, I would like to add a few words about Gaza. Otherwise, likely to rise from his grave and ask me how I can give a lecture in his memory without speaking about what is happening there. For more than a year now, the people of Gaza have been relentlessly displaced, bombed, and starved in front of our eyes. Thousands of civilians have been blown to pieces, buried under the rubble, charred to death, or grievously wounded. Worst of all, in my view, more than 2 million people were deprived all this time of the most basic healthcare. If there is any message in Multatuli's life and work, it is that in a situation like this, we must speak out and stand up with all our might. I am not here to judge what the Belgian government or the Belgian people have done or not done to oppose these war crimes, because I don't know much about it. I am told that Belgium has done better than most European countries in this respect, and I'm glad to hear that. But still, I doubt that any of us here can claim that we have responded to this situation with the urgency it requires. Every day we see harrowing images of Palestinians in Gaza making a desperate appeal for international community to intervene, even as their lives are being shattered. Many countries in the global south, such as South Africa, Colombia, Bolivia, and others, have tried at least to respond to these appeals, for instance, by taking Israel to the International Court of Justice, cutting diplomatic ties with Israel, refusing to handle weapons shipments headed for Israel, or suspending cooperation in other ways. They have shown that what we need in this situation is action, not words. I think that European countries would do well to take a leaf from their book. Now I turn to Social Security finally. Thank you. Thank you. I had some hesitation in raising this issue, but I really think it had to be done, and thank you for listening. So, Social Security, I had some hesitation about this word battle in the title because it has a bit of a militaristic tone. I didn't like it so much, but actually it is a battle, and I think it's important to see that, even for academic purposes. It's not, of course, a battle with weapons. It's a battle with democratic means. It's a battle against the stinginess of the finance ministry. It's a battle against the resistance of the corporate sector. The corporate sector is always, at least in India, opposing increases in social spending because more social spending means higher taxes, or it means higher interest rates, or it means less government money for corporate subsidies, so one way or the other they lose. It's also a battle against, big battle against corruption. And most importantly, I think it's a battle against the inertia or even hostility of a system that doesn't really work for poor people. Now, to clarify this statement, I have to give a little bit of background. I don't want to insult you by telling you things about India that you already know, but since knowledge of India in Belgium is quite limited in my experience, I can see Jean Drèze smiling, let me quickly remind you of a few very basic facts. First fact is that India is still a very poor country, or rather a country with many poor people. This should really go without saying, except that somebody at dinner was asking me, is it really true that poverty in India has more or less disappeared, as the government claims from time to time? No, it's not true. There has been, of course, some progress in poverty reduction, but there are still huge numbers of people in India who are deprived of basic necessities of dignified living, such as nutritious food especially, clean water, school education, healthcare, and a blanket in the winter. Second point, again, fairly obvious, that India is a country of enormous inequalities, maybe one of the most unequal societies in the world. To start with, it has astronomical inequalities of income and wealth, as we know, for instance, from recent work by Thomas Piketty and his colleagues at the World Inequality Lab. The economic inequalities are literally beyond imagination. And to illustrate this point, I sometimes ask my friends the following question. Suppose that 100 workers worked at the minimum wage, non-stop, saving all their earnings until they have accumulated as much as the richest person in India already has. How long would that take? Any guess? You don't count. Somebody else? Any? Huh? 10,000 years. That's the maximum I've heard so far. The correct answer is 1 million years. Now, when I figured that out, this is just a back of the envelope calculation. When I figured that out, I couldn't believe my eyes. I said, this can't be true. So I just kept checking and checking. It's true. You can easily check for yourself. But it's interesting that the highest answer I get is 10,000, which is 1% of the truth. So it means that it's basically off the chart. I mean, it's like we can't imagine. And when you have that kind of wealth, you can buy anything. You can buy the media, you can buy the NGOs, you can buy members of parliament, or at least some of them. You know, you can buy public policies and so on. So the power is enormous. But that's only the economic inequality. And then on top of that, India has very special social inequalities that compound these economic inequalities, like the inequalities of caste and gender. I'll just give you a very quick illustration of the sort of, oops, not moving. This one? Yeah, okay. So this is very simple literacy data from a village called Palampur, where I lived in the early 80s after my PhD, and then I returned there in 1993. This is the literacy rate for different groups. Like all Indian villages, there are different communities and castes in the village. It's a small village. It's like maybe at that time 150 households. And the communities are ranked here in rough hierarchical order. So the Kayasth at the top. Kayasth is a community traditionally involved in clerical kinds of jobs. And then you go down the hierarchy, Thakurs, Muslims, and at the bottom, the Dalits, who are basically the former untouchables who are expected to do some kind of menial work. So you can see that within this small village of 150 households, the literacy rate varies from 0 to 100%, depending on which community and gender you are born in. This is quite extraordinary. I'm not sure any other country has this kind of social inequalities. The Kayasth are all literate, men and women, and one reason is that when the school breaks down, as sometimes happens, they organize tuition at home because the women are educated, so they teach the children. And then there are groups in the same village who are still completely excluded at that time from the schooling system. Now, of course, things have changed. Today, most of the children in that village would be going to school, but if you look at the quality of education, because now they would be going to different schools, public and private, you will still find a lot of inequalities of this sort. Okay, and the third point is about democracy. India is a funny kind of democracy, partly because of these huge inequalities. It does have, of course, some important elements of democracy, such as a credible electoral system, by and large, some degree of separation of powers, and some civil liberties. All these things are important, but that does not make India a democracy in any serious sense of the term. The eminent historian Ramchandra Guha likes to call India a 50-50 democracy, you know, like a glass half full, half empty, we've reached somewhere, now we've got to go further. I don't think this is the correct description. I think it's more like a 90-10 or 80-20 democracy, in the sense that there's a privileged minority for whom the democratic institutions actually work pretty well. If you're a privileged person, upper caste, educated in India, you have quite a lot of freedom. You can write in the newspapers, you can meet your member of parliament, maybe you can even contest elections yourself. You can seek justice from the courts if you're wronged. You know, everything works pretty well. But if you're not part of that privileged minority, then these same institutions are, by and large, out of reach, and sometimes they can even become oppressive. And one clear example of that is the justice, or the so-called justice system, which is a means of grievance redressal for privileged people. It enables them to defend their rights. But for a large majority of people, it's actually a source of oppression and harassment, and they live in fear of it. So the only power that poor people have in that society, or in that 10-90-10 or 80-20 democracy, is their vote, or rather the right to vote every 5 years. And that, of course, is better than nothing. And in fact, all the social policies I'm going to talk about were made possible by electoral politics, almost without exception. So there is some power in electoral politics. But on a day-to-day basis, the right to vote is of little use as a defense against marginalization and oppression. And that's why I said that the system doesn't really work for poor people. This is something they're very conscious about. I had an interesting experience some months ago. I was trying to convey this in an academic paper published in a professional economic journal. But of course, it's very difficult to prove that the system is so insensitive to poor people. I mean, it's not something for which you can easily give objective evidence. So I made a very mild statement, that something to the effect that the government in India is not always very kind to poor people, something like that, very vague. And the referee picked on the statement, and he said, "I'm sure it's true, but I don't think this kind of statement belongs to an academic paper." That set me thinking a little bit, because if you don't understand that, you don't understand much about what's going on in India, and you're not very well placed to think about these social policies. So it's important to know. But on the other hand, he had a point. I mean, in an academic paper, we're supposed to substantiate everything, and it's not very easy to. I can see Eric smiling. We could discuss this later. So there was a bit of a dilemma there. But anyway, it's important to understand this. What a poor person would have written instead of what I wrote, they would have written that we are treated like shit, something like that, because that's the perception. You know, whenever they have to seek something from the government, they face a brick wall. They are made to run from pillar to post. They're not even treated with dignity. So that's the kind of relation they have to the government. And that's a big obstacle in this battle for social security at every step. Okay, so now, against this background, the idea of social security is simply that everyone should have a right to basic necessities of dignified living. It's not a new idea, of course. It's the basic idea behind the welfare state, that nobody should be left in the lurch. It's also an idea that's implicit and, to a large extent, even explicit in the directive principles of the Indian Constitution. These principles, unfortunately, were ignored for a long time. At the beginning of this century, India had virtually nothing by way of social security programs, except for a small section of the workforce in the formal sector. The formal sector is very small in India. It's like maybe 10 to 15% of the workforce. Most of the workforce is in the informal sector, and for that large majority, there was virtually nothing, or at least nothing that really worked. But that has started to change, or at least it was changing until recently. So, we already did that, sorry. Okay, so these are the 5 important pillars of social security, or you could say the emerging pillars of social security in India, as I see them today. And I'm listing them in chronological order, the order in which they appeared, purposely, because these things don't happen according to a plan. They happen when there's a political opportunity to make a step in one direction or another. Now it's beginning to look like some kind of integrated plan, but things come one by one on their own. So the 5 pillars are, firstly, child nutrition and health services, including midday meals in schools. That was the first breakthrough in 2001. And a few years later, the universalization of childcare services for children under 6. Then number 2 is the employment guarantee in rural areas, which Laura has already mentioned, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. I'm going to call it NREGA for simplicity. And then, so that was in 2005. And then in 2013, the National Food Security Act, under which midday meals became a permanent legal entitlement, and then the food rations for 2/3 of the population also became a legal entitlement. And in the same act, there's a provision which, in my opinion, is the most important one, but the most neglected, which is a provision for universal maternity entitlements. And then the 5th pillar is Social Security pensions for the elderly, widows, and persons with disabilities. These are national entitlements, and then at the state level, sometimes there are further programs of this sort, like cash transfers now in quite a few states, an Urban Employment Guarantee Act in Rajasthan, and in the same state, some semblance of Right to Healthcare Act, but it's quite a weak act. And in fact, the big gap in this structure is a proper healthcare system. The healthcare system in India is pretty bad. It's highly privatized, highly commercialized. So you have, on the one hand, a profit-seeking, unregulated, exploitative private sector, and on the other hand, a small and, in most states, very ineffective public sector. So there's something there that really has to be repaired. I'll mention briefly that other important social legislations have also emerged in the last 25 years, such as the Right to Information Act in 2005, the Forest Rights Act in 2006, and the Right to Education Act in 2009. The Right to Education Act is particularly important because it has played a very important role in making all the other programs possible. I'll come back to that point later. Now, this may sound too good to be true, so let me immediately add that the benefits under these programs are quite small. For example, maternity benefits under the National Food Security Act is only 6,000 rupees per child, so that's like 60 euros, I think, which is ridiculously small, even for India. So the benefits are small, but the progress that has been made, I think, is that there's at least a structure now that can become a lasting foundation for a social security system, and the benefits can be raised over time, and in some cases they are being raised over time, not the maternity benefits. Now, before I proceed to comment in more detail on one or two of these programs, let me add a few general remarks on the common characteristics of these programs. One is that these are all effective entitlements in the sense that they are delivered through schemes that actually work. And that's important to say because there was a time in India, and especially in the North Indian states, where most of the government schemes and public services were virtually non-functional. I mean, that same village, Palampur, that I mentioned earlier, when I was there in 1983, it was amazing how all the public services basically were not working. That was the time when Rajiv Gandhi said that 85% of the public money in India goes down the drain. He had no evidence for that particular figure, and I think it was an exaggeration. But yes, it was a time when we could not expect much from public services and social security schemes. I think that has changed. I think now some schemes actually work or can work, and so there is some basic functionality in these programs, despite a lot of implementation issues and inefficiencies, and in some cases corruption and so on, but there is something that works and can work even better. Second point is that all these, except the pensions, the last item, all these are legal entitlements, mainly under the National Food Security Act and the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. And that's important because schemes come and go as political parties come and go. But a law is more durable. It also creates some accountability. It gives some bargaining power to people, and it facilitates collective action. Now, of course, the legal entitlements are not automatically realized. Even when they become legal entitlements, people still have to fight for them in many cases. But at least they have something that they can fight for, something that people have to recognize. I think the best example of a legal right that really has worked in India in this field is the Right to Information Act. I mean, that really has worked wonders. The Right to Information Act basically says that any citizen can ask for virtually any information from the government except things like national security information. Short of that, you can ask anything, virtually anything, and you have a legal right to get it within 30 days. And there are strong penalties on government functionaries if they don't comply. That's the important provision. That's what has made it work. The functionaries are on their toes because they know that their salary can be cut if they don't comply with the demand for information. So millions of people now every year use this Right to Information Act, and it's extensively used in particular by social movements to claim some of these entitlements under the other laws. So that's why I said that the Right to Information Act has helped to make the other laws possible. Now, that's a case of success with legal entitlements. Then there are cases where the legal rights didn't make much difference, at least not so far. For example, the Right to Education Act, I think, has not yet at least made much difference. And then in between, there are various degrees of success in realizing legal rights, but it's always useful to have a legal right. Third point is that there is no targeting in any of these schemes or programs. Targeting used to be the buzzword in social policy because when you don't have much money, then it sounds like you should try to focus it on the poorest people. And in India itself, whatever schemes existed before all this came was always targeted to the so-called BPL population, the below poverty line households. And that approach really didn't work very well because, first of all, it's quite difficult to identify poor households. It's not a stable population. So there were huge exclusion errors. And it's also very divisive because you're basically focusing all the benefits on a small, powerless minority. And then the rest, of course, being excluded, doesn't want these programs to succeed. And so the constituency that has a stake in it is both quite small and has very little power. So that didn't really work very well. And in this approach, there's no targeting. There are three alternatives. One is universal entitlements, like these maternity benefits is for all pregnant women, except those who are already covered in the formal sector. Otherwise, any woman who has a child is, under the law, entitled to maternity benefits. And I think that's justified, because even in relatively well-off households, it's very possible for a pregnant woman to be neglected and to need to have some resources of her own. And then there is self-targeting, like the Employment Guarantee Act, where you're basically saying that those who want to work can work, so they decide for themselves whether to participate in the program. That's self-targeting. There's an element of self-targeting also in the school meal program, because the school meal is for government schools and government-aided schools. And it's mainly the poorer children who go to the government schools. So that's, again, a case of self-targeting. And the third approach is what we call the exclusion approach, where instead of targeting the poor, what you do is you target the rich, you identify the people who are well off, like those who have government jobs, those who have a car, those who have more than 5 acres of land. You exclude them, and then everyone else, by default, is eligible. And that's much safer because the exclusion errors are much smaller. And each approach creates quite a big constituency of people who have a stake in these programs. And that's why the standards of effectiveness of these programs have increased because so many people have a stake in them. I'll just take some water. And the last point is that these are all non-contributory schemes financed from general taxation. There's no contribution. So, for example, if you turn 60, then in most states you have a good chance of getting a pension. You don't have to contribute. In the formal sector, you have to contribute, then you get a pension when you get old. But in the informal sector now, you can get a pension without contribution. You must be wondering what is the cost of all these programs. Laura has mentioned quite rightly that India doesn't spend that much at all on social protection in international perspective. All this is about 2% of GDP, or it was 2% of GDP before there was some defunding in recent years under the Modi government. So you're talking of 2%, about 1% for the food subsidies, maybe 1/2 of 1% for the Employment Guarantee Act, and 1/2 of 1% for the rest. So it's not a lot, and in fact you can, I think, quite easily make a case for higher expenditure on these programs. Okay, now how did all this happen? It didn't happen out of the kindness of the government, that much we can say. It basically happened when the government came under pressure to take initiatives of this sort. And where did the pressure come from? I think first of all from electoral politics. As I mentioned earlier, poor people don't count for very much in India, in India's democracy, but they do have the right to vote. And at election time, the political parties certainly remember them and make all kinds of promises. And then when they come to power, they come under pressure to redeem these promises. That was not the case earlier. Earlier, the electoral promises were just for show. Nobody expected them to be put in practice. But now the electorate has become a little bit more demanding. One good example of this process is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which came in 2005. So what happened is that as the elections were approaching in 2004, everyone knew for sure that the Congress was not going to win, including the Congress itself. Meanwhile, the Congress had somehow warmed up to this idea of employment guarantee. It was not a new idea because the state of Maharashtra already had an Employment Guarantee Act, which had been brought by the Congress. So they kind of liked the idea of doing a national scheme like that. And since they had nothing to lose, because they were going to lose the elections anyway, so they had nothing to lose by making a big promise, they promised an Employment Guarantee Act. And then, contrary to all expectations, they did come to power with the help of the left parties, and they found themselves in this coalition where the left parties put some pressure on this electoral promise to be put into practice. Some Congress leaders themselves insisted on that, and the public also said, you know, you have promised it, now you have to do it. So the Congress basically came under pressure to pass this act, and it was a big surprise. I mean, as late as 2003, nobody would have thought that in their wildest dreams that there could be an Employment Guarantee Act in India. So that's one source of pressure, and then of course another source of pressure is public agitation and mobilization. Even the Employment Guarantee Act, if it had been left to the government after the elections, after the government decided that yes, we will have an Employment Guarantee Act, if things had been left to the government at that point, you can be sure that they would have passed a token law with no teeth. And they tried. If you go back to the draft Employment Guarantee Act that was tabled in Parliament on 21st December 2004, it had no teeth. For example, it had a provision which said that the employment guarantee would come into effect, I'm quoting, in such rural area and for such period of time as may be notified by the central government. That completely defeats the purpose. It's like saying, I'll give you a guarantee of work, but I don't guarantee that the guarantee will be in effect. It gives the government the freedom to withdraw the guarantee anytime. That defeats the whole purpose, okay? And there were other provisions like this that deliberately tried to undermine the guarantee and minimize the responsibility of the government. All that was repaired over a period of a few months through public agitation, pressure from left parties, many workers' organizations, people who organized a convoy through India to demand a strong Employment Guarantee Act. Standing Committee of Parliament also played an important role. So gradually, over a period of about 6 months, the act was repaired, and the act that was passed was actually, in the end, not so bad at all. And then the third useful source of pressure is the Supreme Court, which is quite active in India and responds in particular to public interest litigations. In particular, there's been a huge public interest litigation called the Right to Food case, which went on for 20 years. And in the process, the Supreme Court issued some important orders, like the order in 2001 that directed the state governments to provide cooked midday meals in the schools. So these are the sorts of democratic means that one can use in this battle for social security. I should mention, of course, that economic growth has also helped. If the economy grows at 7% per year in real terms, as it has done in India now for quite a while, and if the share of government revenue in GDP remains more or less constant over time, it means that public revenue will double every 10 years in real terms. So over 20, 30 years, that's quite a lot of extra money. And you can do something with that. So all this would have been much harder to do without this increase of public revenue that came with economic growth. Okay, how am I doing for time? 15, okay, it's not a lot. I'll quickly go over the two specific programs. I'm going to be very short of time, so I'll have to race through them. But one is the school meal program. So the idea of the school meal program is the same as the idea of providing sandwiches in a university seminar. Everyone knows that if you provide sandwiches, attendance will shoot up, because if there's one thing that attracts people, young and old, all over the world, it is free food. It's actually interesting to think that even a university professor who earns a huge salary can be attracted by a free sandwich, but it works. So the first argument for midday meals in the schools was that when the children smell the food, they come to the school. And so all these children, like in Palampur, who have been excluded from the schooling system for so long, started flocking to the schools. Today, most of the children until the age of 14 go to school. I'm not saying it's only for midday meals. It's not at all only because of midday meals. But midday meals have certainly helped. But it's more than that. It's not just attracting the children, making sure that they go to school day after day. It's also, of course, a very important nutrition program. We have to remember that India has some of the highest rates of child undernutrition in the world. So if you provide a hot cooked meal in the schools and also in the Anganwadis, the childcare centers for children below 6, you can actually make a difference to the nutritional status of children. And then there's another important role, which is that the midday meal in the school is a socialization experience. It teaches children of different castes and classes to sit together and share a meal. And that's quite important because the caste system in India is partly enforced through these restrictions on sharing food. It's a very important way in which the system perpetuates itself. So if you teach children from early on to share a meal with children from other communities, that can have some effect on these social barriers. So actually, it's quite a wonderful scheme. It works reasonably well. But even this simple and effective and very popular program, you will be surprised to know how much opposition it has created. From, of course, finance ministries, because they didn't want to spend money. From upper caste parents who didn't like the idea that their children will sit and eat with children from lower castes. Initially, sometimes from teachers who didn't want to waste time organizing the meal because in those early days, there were no kitchens and no helpers and so on. But that, of course, over time improved a lot. But initially, some teachers opposed it. And then there were other astonishing examples of opposition. In 2008, there was an attempt, a failed attempt, by the biscuit industry to hijack this program. The biscuit industry figured out that if the cooked meals in the schools can be replaced with biscuits, it will be a good deal. And so, some biscuit manufacturers, led by Parle Products, you may have heard of them, it's the biggest manufacturer of glucose biscuits in India, formed a bogus association called Biscuit Manufacturers Association. And in the name of that association, they wrote to all members of parliament praising biscuits and giving a pseudo-scientific précis of all the nutritional qualities of biscuits and so on, and asked the members of parliament, using that so-called scientific information, to write to the Minister of Education to request that biscuits should be given to children in the schools. And then they hired a middleman who was a member of parliament himself. His name is Abu Asim Azmi, to go from member of parliament to member of parliament and try to persuade them to act on that letter, presumably bribing many of them in the process, with the result that many members of parliament actually wrote to the Minister of Education, copy-pasting from the letter that they had received from the so-called Biscuit Manufacturers Association, and suggesting that biscuits should be given to children in schools instead of midday meals. 29 of these letters were obtained under the Right to Information Act, and it was quite amazing to read them because they came from all parties except some of the left parties, and the wording was very similar across parties. They included sentences like, the ratio of carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and glucose is quite balanced and beneficial to human health of all age group, especially for children. Mumbo jumbo, copy-pasted from the letter of the Biscuit Manufacturers Association. And many of them also made the argument that biscuits have higher recall. I didn't understand that, so I asked my brother, who is professor of management, what does higher recall mean? And he told me it's a marketing term. It basically refers to remember a product after an advertisement, so it's to measure the effectiveness of advertisement. Now you can imagine that if children are given the same packet of biscuit every day at school, the recall will be pretty good. So that was a kind of involuntary betrayal of the real intent of this whole effort. Anyway, it was exposed, and in fact, even before it was exposed, the Minister of Education thankfully consulted some nutritionists and then rubbished the whole proposal. I'm just giving this example to illustrate the kinds of opposition one faces in this. And then now there's another very interesting battle. I'm going to skip some stuff because we're short of time. The latest battle now is about eggs. Now that may seem like a trivial issue, but it's a big political battle in India. So let me explain. You all know that eggs are a dream food for children. It has good protein, vitamins, minerals, almost everything you need except vitamin C. It has all the essential nutrients. It's also tasty, it's affordable, it's visible, so it's not very easy to poach. Very popular, children in India love to eat eggs, so it ticks all the right boxes. And most people in India eat eggs. There's a myth that India is a vegetarian country. This is not true at all. Majority of people in India are non-vegetarian. There is, of course, a substantial vegetarian minority, And it's true that the vegetarians generally don't eat eggs. They are basically lacto-vegetarians. But in these midday meals, eggs are never compulsory, and there's always a vegetarian option. So if a child doesn't want an egg, they can have a banana or something like that. So it seems like a no-brainer. And yet, there was a lot of opposition. And to understand that, you have to understand that the vegetarians in India are mainly from the upper caste and from powerful communities like the Jains, for example, the Lingayats in Karnataka, the Kabir Pantis in Chhattisgarh, and so on. And for some reason, not only are they practicing vegetarianism, but in this case, they're trying to impose it on others by opposing eggs in midday meals, maybe because they're scared that their children will start eating eggs behind their back if eggs are provided at school. But anyway, in many states, there was a lot of opposition to eggs. And the other thing to understand is that these communities have a lot of clout with the BJP. The strongest electoral base of the BJP is the upper caste, and many of these vegetarians belong to the upper caste. And so it's particularly difficult politically for the BJP to resist these vegetarian lobbies and to provide eggs. So here's an interesting map which shows the number of eggs. Let me explain before you laugh. You can laugh more. So this is state-wise the number of eggs being provided in schools. These are the white eggs. And in the childcare centers, these are the gray eggs. And then in orange, you have the states ruled by the BJP, or BJP is the right-wing Hindu nationalist party, which is in power now at the center, ruled by the BJP or by a coalition that includes the BJP. And in black, you have the other states ruled by other parties. So you can see quite a correlation there. I think, Eric, you can confirm that. You can do a regression, but I think we don't really need that. Now, to be fair, there are one or two of the states in the orange category, like Rajasthan and Gujarat, where there is a large majority of vegetarians who don't eat eggs, and where it would be politically difficult, even for a non-BJP party, to introduce eggs in schools. For example, in Rajasthan, when the Congress was in power, it didn't introduce eggs because they knew it was a sensitive issue. But that's just one or two states. In the other states, even in the other states, the BJP, for the BJP, basically, eggs is a no-no. If I were in the opposition, I think I would try to make a political issue of this. I think one could get some votes by promising eggs as a national policy. But unfortunately, in all the parties, there are leaders who belong to that vegetarian upper caste minority and who would certainly not want any of this to happen. Okay. In between, I wanted to mention that I have not been able to talk about the history of these midday meals, but I'll briefly mention that by now, there's a lot of research on these midday meals and indeed on the other programs as well. And there's a lot of evidence of these effects that were anticipated: increase in school attendance, improvement in nutrition, even improvement in learning achievements and so on. So in the course of time, the evidence came in. But they didn't begin with the evidence. I say that because nowadays in economics, we talk a lot about evidence and evidence-based policy. Most of these programs didn't begin from evidence. They began from experience, from public debate, and from some conviction. And then the evidence came later. But for midday meals, at least, there's by now pretty strong evidence of the benefits. So I guess I'll have to spend 5 minutes now on the Employment Guarantee Act. This is quite sad, but I'm giving a full lecture on the Employment Guarantee Act. Okay, so I'll do what I can within the time available. Yeah, so I'm giving a lecture on this in 2 days' time in Louvain-la-Neuve, but unfortunately it will be in French, so it may not be much of a consolation. I'll very quickly explain the situation. So the Employment Guarantee Act is a very simple idea. It's basically a law that guarantees employment on demand in public works, local public works, to anyone who wants work, subject to a maximum of 100 days per household per year. So any adult in rural area can apply for work. You don't have to prove that you're poor. You don't have to prove that you're unemployed. You don't have to give a reason. You can just ask for work, and then you have a right to be employed on the local public work, like building a well or a tank, or deepening a pond, building a road, leveling the land, all kinds of things like that can be done locally. So you have a right to be employed on the work site of that nature within 15 days. And if you're not employed, you're supposed to receive an unemployment allowance, although in practice that doesn't really happen. And this is subject to a maximum of 100 days per year. Now, how does it happen? Very briefly, it's very decentralized. Decentralization is a fundamental principle of this law. So what happens is that the village councils, they're called Gram Panchayats, in consultation with the village assemblies, called Gram Sabhas, prepare what is called a shelf of projects. So it's a list of projects within a permissible list that can be activated at short notice as and when the need arises. So there's a ready-made list of projects ready to be activated. And then as and when people demand work, the program officer at the block level, which is an intermediate level between the villages and the district, sanctions work so that those who demand work can be employed. That's the basic process. I'm skipping a lot of steps, of course. Now, in practice, it doesn't always, of course, happen exactly according to the rules. And there are also cases where corrupt middlemen capture these work sites and organize them on behalf of the village council. They inflate the work attendance sheets called muster rolls so that more money comes than is required to pay the workers, and then they pocket the difference after paying a commission to the concerned officials, like the secretary of the village council or the engineer and so on. So that does happen. But anyway, the way it's supposed to happen is that the village council plans the works, and then the works are activated as and when the demand arises. I'll quickly show you a few photos so that you get an idea of how it works. You can see from this one that there are areas in India, at least, where a huge amount of work can be done. These women are building what is called contour trenches, so basically a way of slowing down the runoff of the water in the monsoon and slowing down the erosion of the soil. And then after building these trenches, you can plant some trees there. You can try to regenerate the forest. You can see there's plenty of scope for this sort of work, at least in some areas. You can see that it's hard work, but still, for these women, it's actually much better work than what they can get in the private market. There are reasonable work norms. They get the same wages as men, which is not the case in the private sector. And there's also much less sexual exploitation on these work sites than in the private sector, because the women work together in a public space, whereas in the, let's say, the private construction sites, for example, there's a lot of exploitation. So it's a program that has attracted a lot of women. I think you've mentioned that already. Huge participation of women. It was close to 50% at the beginning of the program, and today it's about 60%. So 60% of the workers are women. And that's very important because rural women in India have very few opportunities for paid employment. They work, of course, very hard, but mainly at home and in the fields, the family fields. They have very few opportunities to earn their own income. And that plays a big role in the disempowerment of women in India because they are dependent on the men all the time. They have no work, no paid work. They have no property because the property is inherited by the male line. They don't have much education, so they're completely dependent on the men for their survival. And that's a big factor of disempowerment. So the Employment Guarantee Act, it's not just about removing poverty, it's also about empowering women, empowering marginalized groups, and also helping the working class to organize. Quickly, a few more work sites. This is deepening of a pond. This is the pond after it's been completed, where you can use the water for irrigating fields, for drinking water for cows and buffaloes. And if you're lucky, you can also grow fish in these ponds. And then you have projects like these wells. In Jharkhand, where I live, which is one of the worst governed states, which has one of the worst records of implementing this program, nevertheless, 100,000 wells like this were built. And you can see that it's not badly built, because the owner of the land has a strong incentive to make sure that the well is well built, and people have the skills. These wells are built without any engineer input. It's the local people who are doing it on their own. And the economic returns on these wells are pretty good, even if you talk only of financial returns. You look at what it costs to build a well, and then what you earn from it later in the form of higher agricultural output and so on. It's actually better than putting your money in the bank, even in pure financial terms. Forget about the social benefits. Even more productive are the mango groves. And then we have to be honest and admit that there are also many work sites like this one, where no useful work has been done, and the private contractor that I mentioned earlier just came and asked the workers to do some symbolic work so that there's something to show in case there is an inspection. And a lot of the money has been siphoned off. So that is one of the big obstacles to the implementation of this act. Now, when the act came into force, the main weapon we thought we had to prevent this was the Right to Information Act. The Right to Information Act and the Employment Guarantee Act came at the same time. They came together. And partly because we thought the Right to Information Act is essential to prevent this sort of thing. And the idea was that corruption thrives on secrecy. Corruption usually is hidden. And so if everything becomes transparent, then there will be no secrecy, and corruption will be much more difficult. Now, that was actually partly true, but actually over-optimistic, because it's one thing to disclose the information, and it's another one to verify the information. If the information is available, all the documents are there in the public domain, on the website, and so on, but nobody is verifying the documents, it doesn't really help. And that's what led to the idea of social audits, where the documents are actually taken out, verified, first by a team of social auditors, and then in public in this kind of assembly. And that was another step forward in controlling corruption. But even that is actually not enough, because it's one thing to disclose the information, it's one thing to verify the information, but the next thing you have to do is to take action on the crooks. If you don't take action on the crooks, they will continue. And that's where I think there's been a huge failure from both central government and state governments, because there's not enough political will to control these crooks, partly because the crooks are in cahoots with the political parties, and some of the political parties are protecting them. Now, I'll try to wind up in 2 minutes. All said and done, by 2011-12, which is the last year for which we have independent household surveys that we can use to validate the official data. So this is about 5 years into the program. By that time, according to official statistics, 50 million households were employed under this program over the year, not full-time, of course, but for varying lengths of time. And 2.2 billion person days of employment were generated. So that's about 40 days per household for those who are employed. 50 million households means about 1/4 of the rural population. So 1/4 of the households worked under the program, and for 40 days on average, with a huge proportion of women and also a disproportionate participation of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, who are the most marginalized groups. And this is the important point, this is largely corroborated by these two independent surveys, the India Human Development Survey and the National Sample Survey. The bulk of the expenditure at least the labor expenditure, was actually reaching these workers. I think that's a substantial achievement. Now, what happened after that is not very clear. If you look at official statistics, it's more or less the same today as it was in those days. I am skeptical of that. I think that actually there has been a setback in the program. How and why it happened is a long story. I think I'll have to leave that story for the day after tomorrow. But basically the program has gone off the radar a little bit. If you ask me for a two-sentence explanation of what happened, I think what happened in a nutshell is that there are too many vested interests against this program. The large farmers don't like it because it raises the local wages. The employers, the business sector, they don't like it. The political parties, as I have mentioned, sometimes try to milk the program instead of trying to make it work. So there are a lot of obstacles. And the workers have not been able to build enough countervailing power to overcome these obstacles. And here it's important to mention that one of the main ideas of this act, it was not just poverty reduction, it was not even just empowering women and Dalits and so on. It was also helping the workers to organize. And we really thought at that time that within a few years of this act coming into force, if it works, there would be a proliferation of workers' organizations all over the country, because this is an organizer's dream. Now that process has not happened actually to anything like the extent that was expected. It has happened in some pockets, and in these pockets, the Employment Guarantee Act, I think, is still working quite well. But in many other areas, I think that the organizational work hasn't really happened. And because of that, the workers have been losing ground, and the program has suffered, also because the Modi government is not so keen on it, but anyway. So there's a longer story around this. I'll just show you one more. I wanted to show you some data about the benefits of the program. I'll end by saying that despite the recent setback, the program has shown its mettle during the COVID crisis. This is employment, percentage of employment every year. And you can see that on two occasions it spiked. One is after the financial crisis of 2008, and one is during the COVID crisis. And that's an important aspect of this program, that it has a very strong counter-cyclical effect. Even more so when you look at the seasonal distribution of employment over the year. It shoots up in the slack agricultural season in April, May, June, and then it goes down in the rest of the year. So it's very strong from the point of view of counter-cyclicality. So despite the recent loss of steam during the COVID crisis, at least, the program made a huge contribution because, remember, hundreds of millions of people at that time who were living on the margin to start with had to spend months without any earnings, any employment, and that's when they had to fall back on this program and also other programs like the food rations and the social security programs I have mentioned earlier. I guess I'll have to stop here for shortage of time. One can keep talking about these things. I could have said similar things about the other programs that I have mentioned. But anyway, the long and short is that the battle continues. It has become more difficult now under the Modi government because, firstly, it's quite an authoritarian government that doesn't have much tolerance for public agitation, and is not very interested in rights-based programs. It's all right, it's okay with certain types of schemes, especially the schemes that give credit to the Prime Minister, but it's not very keen on these rights-based legislation. But the battle continues, and the silver lining is that at the state level, there is still some space for initiatives of this kind. In fact, this year, there was another breakthrough in Rajasthan where not only an Urban Employment Guarantee Act was passed, but also the first law that gives legal entitlements to pensions. So we can still make some progress. And I'll just conclude on one simple point. And here I'm addressing myself particularly to the young researchers in this audience. I don't see so many of them, but I see some. And the point is that if social security is a battle, then researchers cannot avoid thinking about their role and their position in this battle. And that's one reason why I mentioned the word battle, because it forces us to think of where we stand. Now, the traditional answer, I think, in academia is that we should not be part of this battle. We should, our role is to shed light on the facts, bring out, what are the costs and benefits of these programs and so on and so forth, but not really engage actively in this battle. Now, to this, I would respond that academia does not have the monopoly of research, and that nothing prevents us from putting our research skills at the service of public action in other ways, for instance, by engaging with collective organizations that are working for change, because those are the organizations that have brought all these advances. And I would add that even if you prefer to remain aloof from the battle and to remain within the confines of academia and to focus on the facts, even then I think that you need to think about where you stand in this battle, because if you don't, the chances are that you will be swayed in one way or another by the more powerful side. And if you do, then this is likely to help you to decide how to go about your research, what kinds of questions to ask, what methods to use, who to collaborate with, and how to communicate your findings. Thank you once again for inviting me. It was a wonderful occasion for me, and it will be a memorable occasion for me. Thank you. Bye.
So there is time for a Q&A, so you can ask a question, raise your hand. It would be also nice if you could present yourself. There's a micro is coming to you.
I'm sorry, I just realized that I was perhaps not displaying the correct slides when I was speaking. I apologize for that, so I hope there was no confusion. On this one, very quickly, these are some of the rates of return that we calculated on some of these projects. I mentioned the wells. The wells at that time turned out to have a rate of return of around 66%, which is not so bad. But later, when we looked at other things like plantation of mango trees, it was even higher. So the rates of return on the better projects, these are not the average projects. These are the better projects. These rates of return are really huge. I mean, you cannot get this from a normal industrial project. And they are not the average project, but I think that most projects could be like this if the program is implemented properly. So I'm just clarifying the slide on the screen.
Yeah. Thank you so much for it was a wonderful talk. I wanted to, rather than a question, this might end up sounding like a remark, but recently, I'm here, yeah. Recently in the G20 summit, Narendra Modi claimed that the Indian government got 250 million people out of poverty in Rio de Janeiro. And yeah, I feel like I see a lot of data gaps coming in the way the government claims to remove poverty. At the same time, during COVID, there were international organizations that were saying that 1/3 of the middle-class population has actually dropped into poverty. So there's this temporal way in which I see how poverty is being framed by the government and how we are experiencing that in India. And I wanted to know what you think about this, how this kind of narrative negatively impacts the poverty schemes and the way poverty is dealt with in India.
Yeah, okay. So I'm not sure exactly what statement Modi made in that summit, but over time, there is a trend in India of declining poverty. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And of course, the absolute numbers can easily sound very large because India has such a huge population. So in the last 20 years, I think there has been some significant poverty reduction. And I think partly because there was, on the one hand, rapid growth, and on the other hand, some serious initiatives to expand the social sector. So I think we're seeing some results from that. The government claims that the speed of poverty reduction increased under Modi. I don't think that's a very well substantiated claim. And in fact, one of the striking trends in the Indian economy, which very few people talk about, is that in the last 10 years, there's been virtually no increase in real wages. I can show you a graph if you like. It's quite disturbing. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no poverty reduction, because people can still move towards the better paid occupations. So, but I think that the claim that there was an acceleration in poverty reduction in recent years is difficult to agree with. But over time, of course, there is poverty reduction, and that translates into large millions and tens of millions. So there's nothing there particularly implausible.
Hi, thank you so much for this very interesting lecture. I know it's not your main research interest, the hunger in Belgium. Did you hear my hunger in Belgium? Okay, so do you follow elections in Belgium?
Elections? No, I'm sorry.
No, but okay, so then
Belgium doesn't have too much importance in India, I'm sorry to say. But yeah,
of course, but so during the run-up to the recent elections last spring, there was quite some attention or awareness about empty lunch boxes, and they were actually suggesting that Belgium needed a free lunch program. So actually I want to ask you, do you think that would make sense based on your experience?
Well, the short answer is I think so, yes. I think so. And many rich countries have school meal programs. There's an amazing video on YouTube about school meals in Japan. It's extraordinary. I mean, the quality of the food and the way the entire process, the hygiene, the way they grow a lot of the food on the school premises, and it's also a form of, it's an occasion for nutrition education, and then the children help to wash dishes. I mean, you can do a lot of things around the midday meal. And it's very good food and nutritious food. And even in the US, there's interesting nutrition programs, not only in the schools, but in the universities. So I like the idea. I mean, I think it's something that it's not just for undernourished countries. But of course, you have to see how it fits with the, other social security programs, and whether it's the best place to put your money, whatever money you have. But I think it's something that is pretty good to have if you can. Yeah. And I also like the idea of all the children eating together, even in a country that doesn't have a caste system, because we have a class system. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I was quite interested to see in the 5 different programs. The last one was pensions, basic pensions for the elderly, for survivors, and for invalids.
Yes.
Which is my kind of social security.
Yes.
So I just wondered, could you say a word of how far they have got with that?
So, so this varies a lot by states, because it's supposed to be a national program. In fact, it's called National Social Assistance Program. But the central government contribution is very small, and it has not increased now for a very long time, because the Modi government is not interested in this scheme. They want contributory programs. So the central government contribution is small, but many states have made up for that and put in their own money. both to increase the coverage of pensions and to increase the amounts. So in many states now, it's almost universal, not completely, but like in Jharkhand where I live, it's more or less universal. So any elderly person, any widow, any disabled person, they get a pension. It's not very much, it's like 1,000 rupees a month or something, so like 10 euros. In some states, 2,000-3,000 rupees a month. It's not much, but it matters a lot for people. I mean, if you're an elderly couple, you don't have children who support you, you're just somehow surviving from this and that. If you have a regular monthly income in cash of even just 1,000 or 2,000 rupees, it does make a big difference. And as I said, the idea is that benefits will increase over time. So I think these are pretty good programs again, because it really goes to the most vulnerable people. And transaction costs are not very high. It's basically a bank payment every month. And there's not much corruption because it's not easy to siphon off that money. So I think these pension programs are really good, and they have been expanding quite a lot in the last 10, 20 years, and hopefully they will continue to expand. And the new law in Rajasthan that I've mentioned is quite a breakthrough because it makes it a legal right, and it says that the amounts will increase by 15% per year. I mean, that's actually quite a lot. It's not sustainable in the long run, but presumably what will happen is that it will increase by 15% per year until it reaches something like half of the minimum wage or something like that, and then it will adopt a new norm. But it means that that program will expand quite fast in the next few years. So I think this is, among these programs, one of those that, along with school meals, that I think are most valuable. I think the ones that are a bit more problematic are, to some extent, the Employment Guarantee Act and the food rations. I mean, that's where there's still a lot of corruption and inefficiency.
Thank you. Does it make sense to compare the approach or the track record of China and India in terms of poverty alleviation? Is there something that India can learn from China, that China can learn from India, or is this a nonsensical question on my behalf?
Okay, so I have not studied the Chinese social security system for a long time, but China, of course, has been growing at astonishing rate for a long time. Now, of course, it's faltering a little bit since COVID, but before that, for 30, 40 years, they've been growing at astronomical rates. So that's driven a lot of the poverty reduction. I think what India really has to learn from China is the importance of education and human capital, as we call it in economics. That's really where India has dramatically failed. Even today, the schooling system for a large proportion of children is a total disaster. Whereas China, very early on, before liberalization in the late 70s, had really expanded the school education system and also the healthcare system. So they have a much more educated and healthy workforce. And that means that people actually participate in the growth process. In India, the problem is that the growth rates are pretty high now, but the wages are stagnating. Why are the wages stagnating? Because you have this huge reserve army of labor, of people who don't have any marketable skills. They may have skills of a different sort, but they don't have many skills that they can use on the market. And so that huge reserve of labor is depressing the wages. So, and of course, there are many other reasons to invest in education. It's not just for growth. It's for everything. It's for social change. It's for demographic change. It's for democracy. It's for health. It's for nutrition. I mean, if there's one thing we have learned in development economics in the last 20 years, it's the importance of education. So I think India made a big mistake in that respect, and China did much better, and that accounts for a lot of its success. Despite the fact that China is so much ahead of India now, it's possible that it could learn from some of these initiatives. I mean, employment guarantee, I think, one reason why I talk about it is that I feel that the world needs to know more about this, because India has shown that it can work, and not over 1 or 2 years. It has shown over 20 years that employment guarantee can happen and that it's sustainable. So I think many countries could take inspiration from this, and possibly China itself. Yeah.
Okay, just one question, and then we finish.
Hello. I wanted to ask, the returns on the programs that you just explained in the latter slides,
Yeah.
where do those astronomically high returns for such simple process like projects go? Who gets the money, since the land is owned by private owners? And also, you said the work is subsidized, so it's state paid, but the project still stays on private land, so who gets the return? Do they get reinvested in the other workforce projects, or just the private owner of the land gets the return on the investment?
Okay. So I'll take this opportunity to clarify a little bit about these rates of return. So these are financial rates of return. So like a well, you look at how much it costs to build a well, and then you look at the returns in terms of higher output in the future, and you calculate the rate of return. Now, in this case, the cost actually is borne by the government, and the benefits come to the farmer. So for the farmer, it's a good deal. Now, one interesting question that this raises is that if these are such good investments, like building a well or planting mango trees, how come people were not doing it on their own? Because we're talking about financial returns, so it means that even as a financial investment, it is a good thing to do. So how come people were not doing it on their own? And the answer is very simple. They didn't do it because they didn't have the capital, and they can't take the risk. And building a well is quite expensive. It's like 200,000, 300,000 rupees. And the well can collapse. I mean, when you build a well, if it's not finished by the monsoon, it will collapse during the monsoon. So there's a small proportion of wells that collapse before they are completed. So it's quite risky for a private farmer. These are small farmers. So it's quite risky for them to invest in a well, despite the fact that the returns are high. And that's a very important aspect of this employment guarantee program, that it helps people to make investments that are actually financially viable, but that they can't make on their own. So this almost, I mean, if all the projects were like this, which is not the case, if all the projects were like this, then this alone would justify the entire program, because it would mean that the program is basically self-financing. So yeah, this is, I think, quite an important role that this program can play, is to enable these productive investments that are not happening for lack of capital and lack of risk-bearing ability.
Yeah, I have here still someone who wants to ask a question.
Yes, thank you for your empowering lecture. You gave the young researchers the advice, but I think it's for everyone, to think who to collaborate with. And when I listen to you, I see also that, or I think that your change programs are also programs of social movement or activism. What did you learn in your collaborations?
Thank you. Okay, so I deliberately said who to collaborate with, because this is something I've learned in this entire process. That, you know, in economics, we do a lot of solo kind of work. You know, we sit, we crunch some numbers, we read some literature, and then we come up with some ideas. I think that it's actually quite important to work with others from different disciplines, from different backgrounds, and to engage with people who are working for change. If your objective is to bring about some actual change, if you want to do economics because you like it and you like reading and writing, that's fine with me. But if your objective is to bring about some practical change, then I think you have to engage, go out and collaborate with people from other perspectives and other backgrounds. I would even say that if that's your objective, it can be quite dangerous to work on your own. really, because we all have professional blinkers. Economists have blinkers, activists for that matter sometimes have blinkers, everybody has blinkers. And when we collaborate, when we work collectively, it's much easier to shed these blinkers. And we learn a huge amount from each other. One thing I had meant to mention, but I didn't have time, is that a lot of these programs came out of experience, not evidence. Evidence is one thing. Experience is not exactly the same as evidence. For example, midday meals, I had meant to read a little quote. The first midday meal program was in Tamil Nadu, in the south of India. It began a long time ago, but in 1982, there was a big breakthrough when the chief minister decided that we have to have midday meals in all the schools, and he bulldozed the opposition. And the reason is that he himself was a class 5 dropout, and he had been hungry in his childhood, and he knew in his bones that we cannot allow this. We have to give midday meals. And this is what he said when the scheme was inaugurated in 1982. This scheme is an outcome of my experience of extreme starvation at an age when I knew only to cry when I was hungry. But for the generosity of a woman next door who offered a bowl of rice gruel to my mother and us when we were starving for 3 days and saved us from the cruel hand of death, we would have left this world long ago. Such merciful women, having great faith in me, elected me as the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu. To wipe the tears of these women, I have taken up this project. It is rooted in his own experience. It's almost the same as the creation of the National Health Service in the UK. The driving force behind that was, it's not Beveridge, I think we tend to remember Beveridge. It was Annie Bevan, who was the health minister at that time, who came from a mining family, who had lost siblings, who had had TB and could not be saved because they had no access to medical care. So when he became health minister, he was adamant that we have to provide healthcare to everyone as a public service, and that led to the creation of the National Health Service. So the point I'm making is that we can really learn a lot by engaging with people who have experiences of different sort. And in many of these programs, that's what drove the initiative, and the evidence came later. It doesn't have to come later, of course. I mean, sometimes it comes earlier, and it may be a good thing. But most of the program I've talked about came from experiences on the ground, including the National Employment Guarantee Act, and came from a collective reflection among people who were on the ground. And it's quite humbling, actually, when you are part of these discussions, to discover how much people know and how much they understand. I mean, when you talk about the Employment Guarantee Act, if you sit with workers, activists, even government officials, people who know this, backwards, they know every detail and they are passionate about it and they have ideas. It's really quite humbling. And then you go to an academic seminar where there's a lot of quantitative analysis and everything. Very useful, it can be very useful. But the level of knowledge is nothing like what you can find among these people who have a passion for these programs. So anyway, collaboration, critical. I mean, if you're talking of practical change, collaboration is critical, both with people from other disciplines and with people from beyond academia and from the world of action.
That seems a nice way to end. So it's time to wrap up the evening presentation, but I don't want to do that without thanking a number of people. First and foremost, of course, our guest speaker. It was a wonderful talk. It was not only because of the content, but also the engagement, the passion, the Multatuli passion within it for justice. I would also thank Helene and Veerle for all the organization, and especially also Erik Schokkaert, the former president of Metaforum. He is the person who suggested inviting Jean Drèze and who made the contact with him. They share the same kind of scientific and social commitment. Thank you, Eri. Should you wish to engage in further discussion regarding the lecture, we would be delighted to facilitate this by offering refreshments in the Jubileumzaal. So we therefore invite you to accompany the speaker to the other side of the staircase hall where the reception will be held. Thank you very much.